a hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 97 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on a rainy Friday here in New York. If you're catching up with this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if you're listening to this episode on one of the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. So I feel like some of the recent episodes have been pretty heavy with retrospectives and remembrances of some greats who passed either recently or celebrating birthdays in memoriam. So I certainly wanted to make today's episode a little lighter. And I'm someone who enjoys certainly seeing the success of other people, other YouTubers with far more experience and far more followers than me, people who've been doing this for so long and consistently churning out fantastic content, what I aspire to do as well. And I enjoy watching people react to classic movies. It's such a weird concept. And if somebody had told me this a number of years ago, I said, what a fucking stupid idea that is. Who cares? But in the right hands, for someone like me, who is a cineast, a film geek, particularly from the beginning of the silent period through the 1990s, watching a neophyte react to a favorite movie, it's a lot of fun. Maybe for other people it'd be boring as shit, but for me it's a lot of fun. And so one of my favorite movie reactors, the account is called Popcorn in Bed, and it's a woman, she's a mom, she lives near New York, but I don't think she lives in New York. Her name is Cassie. She's great. She grew up with apparently a father who was a Star Trek fanatic, but she never watched any Star Trek, so she recently caught up on all the Star Treks. Anyway, her channel is incredible. She has like 400,000 subscribers. She has Patreons. She's making money hand over fist. I mean, Tom Cruise and Chris McQuarrie, the filmmaker of Mission Impossible, the last bunch of movies, they invited her to the premiere of Dead Reckoning Part 1 because they were such huge fans of her. So she reacted to a movie that was one of my father's favorite films, certainly in his top 10. And it's Ivan Reitman's 1993 Frank Capra-esque comedy, Dave. And watching her reaction of a movie I hadn't seen in probably at least 8 or 9 years reminded me of just how underappreciated Kevin Kline's performance is in that film. It's a movie that's very well remembered by Gen Xers, young boomers, even just general boomers, and elder millennials. It is considered one of the better comedies of that decade. It came out the same year, a few months after Groundhog Day. And honestly, Dave to me is so good, it's almost as good as Groundhog Day. That's really saying something because Groundhog Day is absolute all-timer. But for me, in different ways, so is Dave. And because the movie works so well, and the supporting cast from Frank Langella, Sigourney Weaver, Kevin Dunn, even Laura Linney in a small role, the supporting cast is so good, it's easy to overlook the guy at the center, Kevin Kline, who pulls off a marvelous dual role, and he does it so effortlessly. And Kline was somebody who, he had won an Oscar for A Fish Called Wanda, a movie I'm supposed to like more than I do. I never really warmed to it. I just thought Kline's character he was just such an asshole. It threw the movie completely out of whack for me. But there was always talk coming up through the 80s. Kline was an enormous talent. Great at comedy, great at drama, that he could do anything. And I feel like even though he won the Oscar for A Fish Called Wanda, and people love that performance, it's like a screwball villain, if that's a thing. But what he does in Dave is something far more impressive to me. With very little time for one of the characters, he manages to make President of the United States, William Harrison Mitchell, Bill Mitchell, he makes him a real person in about 2 scenes. We get enough to realize who this guy is. This was someone who was probably once idealistic, clearly brilliant, and now just doesn't give a shit, and he's corrupt as the day is long. The main character who Kline plays for 95% of the movie, is just a regular guy named Dave. And Dave, not surprisingly, is a dead ringer for the President of the United States. And this is some kind of a silly thing that has happened where presidents will occasionally have someone who looks like them for events where they're not going to be that close to the press or to cameras. This wouldn't work now where people have a camera in your face 100% of the time. So he is asked by the Secret Service to just wave to the cameras, tempt for the president, don't do anything which might arouse suspicion, because everyone all agrees he really looks like it. This is not just a random look-alike. He looks exactly like he could be his twin brother, which is part of the joke because obviously we know it's the same actor playing both roles. Well, if that's just what the story was, it wouldn't be much of a movie. So after we establish Dave Kovic and President Bill Mitchell, President Bill Mitchell is sidelined. He has a medical issue. And not just the Secret Service, but the White House Chief of Staff and his assistant, they might both be chiefs of staff, played wonderfully by Frank Langella, who usually played heavies, and he more or less plays a heavy here, and Kevin Dunn, who has done Good Guys and Bad Guys, is a very talented actor. They play the guys who make the decision, we're not going to tell the vice president what's going on, that the president's been incapacitated. We don't really like him. They tell Dave, we need you to stay on a little bit longer. Don't do anything stupid. Follow our lead. And luckily for you, there's really not that much of a relationship anymore between President Mitchell and the First Lady. So they have to tell him certain things that he normally would never know. Because for the public's eyes, they have a beautiful marriage. The First Lady, she does charitable work and he supports it and all of this kind of shit. But in reality, they hate each other's guts. But specifically, she hates the president's guts. So the hope is Dave is going to be able to, the few times that he might have to share space with the First Lady, bluff his way through. And that facially, he looks enough like him, she's not going to be able to tell the difference because they haven't been close in years. So from this comedic premise, the story takes flight where a CPA, an accountant, Dave, is the President of the United States. And he can't tell anybody what he's doing, except one friend, a fellow accountant, played by Charles Grodin, who is just a fantastic actor, particularly in comedies. He did some dramas, but when he has a chance to do that slow burn he was famous for, and that pause, Grodin is in 2 scenes, maybe 3, and every minute with him is a treasure. And it's why he was beloved, even though many boomers and Gen Xers just remember him. Oh, he was the dad in Beethoven. They don't remember that he teamed with Robert De Niro in what I believe is the single best buddy movie period ever made, Midnight Run. That's a movie that's now 36 years old. The average person under 40, they don't really know that movie. They would have had to seek it out. When I was a kid, they ran it on HBO and Cinemax. It seemed like it was on every day between those 2 channels. But Kline, as Dave, we follow him through this journey. And when he first starts pretending to be president, he's taking direction. He allows himself to be manipulated and maneuvered, more so by Frank Langella as Bob Alexander, the White House Chief of Staff. And he's a guy who was a serious player in Hollywood. He had been a senator. He was on various commissions. You know, he's a heavy hitter. But he's a piece of shit. He's a terrible guy. And he lets himself be monkeyed around with. But then his decisions start having real world repercussions. And he finds that he can't play ball anymore. And it's so subtle and brilliant the way he gently starts to gradually assert himself in the quietest of ways. It's the sort of thing where if you do it all at once, they're probably going to have his head cut off. Certainly, Frank Langella's character would do it without hesitation. But the way that he gradually starts to fulfill the role as if he really is the president is part of the beauty of how well constructed this film is, and how there is a certain point in the movie where we realize it's not a question of they can't control him anymore. It's a question of what are they supposed to do? They can't just remove him. Their whole house of cards depends upon him fulfilling his duties as president, since the actual president is incapacitated. We have to produce a body, they have to produce a president. So when he finally pisses off Langella, you say, well, what the hell can they do now? How are they going to get out of this pickle? And what are they going to do with the First Lady? So, of course, a major thing in the movie is she going to find out? What is she going to do when she finds out? And how is all of this going to turn? And you see whatever hatred that the president's wife, Ellen Mitchell, the First Lady, had for Bill Mitchell, she still loved him, even though he was a snake. We're led to believe he was just a really shitty husband and had humiliated her repeatedly and continued to do so. But you see that she still cares. There's a part of her that cares, and a part of her that is still attracted to him, which is actually not him. It's this guy who you might say embodies the qualities of the man that she fell in love with. And when she finds out that this is not my husband, this is not Bill Mitchell, this is some random accountant that lives a couple of miles from the White House, none of that side of the story progresses the way you expect it to. See, the film is formulaic. It has the Frank Capra, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington kind of thing going, where you have one guy trying to do good for the people and being beaten down by those who don't give a shit. They're only interested in lining their own pockets. And one of the ironies is that's what Bill Mitchell was doing as president. He was getting rich off the backs of other people. And Ben Kingsley, Sir Ben Kingsley, shows up late in the film. His character, he's the vice president, is teased throughout the movie. And it's the sort of thing where Ivan Reitman knew he needed an actor of stature to play somebody who's going to show up late in the movie and be critical to the unfolding of the third act. And when Kingsley does show up and we realize, okay, they're going to try to destroy this guy, Kingsley's line readings are amazing. He almost takes over the movie just by how strong he registers, or how strongly he registers. And he has a couple of scenes with who he thinks is the president, but who is in reality an accountant pretending to be president. But in those scenes, we realize that these two guys, although they've worked together for years, they don't really know that much about one another. Because when Kevin Kline as Dave, aka President Mitchell, when he asks Ben Kingsley, Mr. Vice President, how did you get into politics in the first place? The look on Ben Kingsley's face is not one of, what the fuck is this guy asking me? He knows this. It's a look of surprise that, wow, he's actually interested, where I'm having a conversation with this guy, because we're led to believe that there's been some contentiousness between these guys, even as president and vice president. And then when Dave explains his start in politics, which should be Bill Mitchell's start in politics, the vice president doesn't know any of this. So the story develops, and it puts the characters in what appears to be an impossible fix, where you say to yourself, in what way could this be resolved amicably, neatly, or in any way that everyone's not going to end up going to jail? And I remember seeing the movie for the first time, and no spoilers, but an event takes place while Kevin Kline as Dave is giving a speech in front of Congress. And this is the sort of thing that probably would have gotten coverage as if it was a State of the Union. Again, no spoilers, but given the stakes of what's being discussed in the movie at this particular juncture. And something happens where I remember the audience gasping. And then all of a sudden he said, wait a minute. This has to be part of the narrative here, part of the act, part of the con of Dave Kovic. He is not really the president of the United States. He's literally playing one on TV. So through all of the contortions of plot, Kevin Kline as Dave nails every scene. He doesn't take any scenes off. He has some great moments with Ving Rhames, who plays the head Secret Service agent responsible for protection of him. Kind of like what later in the year Clint Eastwood was on protection detail for the president. Now that was a film that was a political thriller about John Malkovich's former government assassin deciding he wants to bump off the president. Ving Rhames plays a variation on that character, only he's assigned specifically to this president, Bill Mitchell, and now Dave. Even in the quiet moments that Dave shares with Ving's character, you see the gears turning. And Kline plays the decency of Dave Kovic, a guy who never could have succeeded in politics. He's too nice. He's too nice. He's too wholesome. It's not the way politics works, right? You know this. We've seen it for decades. Well, people my age have seen it for decades. But the movie has a hopefulness to it, a gentleness of spirit, more so even than Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and some of the other Frank Capra films in that ballpark. Because Mr. Smith to Washington paints a pretty bleak picture of what Washington does to idealistic young people. And again, the kind of, it's not really tragedy, but the sad part, based on what we know of Ellen Mitchell, the First Lady, is that Bill Mitchell was once young and idealistic. He wasn't always the way that we see him at the beginning of the movie. He was somewhat like Dave Kovic as he takes over and begins to assume responsibilities and the power of the office. And the movie wraps up the only way that it can, but as you're watching it, you're not necessarily thinking, oh, well, I know exactly how this movie is going to end, because you really don't. You have no way of knowing that how it's going to wrap up, because there's so many different plot threads that are doing this while the main plot is here, there's other stuff going like that. And they managed to pull it together and wrap it up beautifully. There's a little bit of sadness, of course, but it's still triumphant. And unlike Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, there is a real sense of, in this instance, the good guys win. A good guy wins, but in a very subtle way, not in a broad, splashy way, not in a, this senator outlasted the entire chamber, but in a way of, it was like the poster for the movie, one of the posters said that this is Dave. When he was given a chance to make things better, he did. And that is exactly the point of the movie. It's Pollyanna-ish, like pie in the sky type of stuff, but it works. And they, the filmmakers, and Ivan Reitman, they were able to get a lot of real life senators and television personalities to play themselves. Like Jay Leno has a couple of funny moments. And John McLaughlin, who had that famous Saturday, I think it was a Saturday morning show where they used to angrily argue politics, 35 years ago. McLaughlin Group, what's going on with President Mitchell, like that. It adds to the verisimilitude, the realism of the story, even as we are presented this kind of comedic narrative. And Kevin Kline, he gets the laughs, and Ivan Reitman even finds time for some celebrity cameos, which one of them will hit for almost anyone, and the other unfortunately is going to get lost to most people who are under 40. So Arnold Schwarzenegger was he was on the President's Council for Physical Fitness. He was actually the chairman of the President's Council for Physical Fitness when George Herbert Walker Bush was president. And Arnold used to make appearances. He would go to schools, just kind of doing what his character does in Kindergarten Cop, which is getting young people to be excited and interested in exercising and not eating donuts. So Arnold shows up about maybe 45 minutes into the movie, and it's one of the highlights of the film. And we forget, Ivan Reitman and Arnold worked together a couple of times. They did Twins together, with DeVito. They did Junior together. And it's a moment that comes out of nowhere, and it's so good to see Arnold. And that was the Arnold as he was making Last Action Hero. So he was in his mid-40s. He looks phenomenal. But true to form, Arnold is telling the school kid, don't eat the donuts. You have to eat healthy. The best cameo, though, they got Larry King, the late, great, if you want to say great, 6 or 7 times married former journalist, radio broadcaster, and talk show host, Larry King Live on CNN for so many years. They got Larry King to do a mock-up of his CNN program. And the filmmaker, who's still around, I love him, Oliver Stone. He did Platoon. He did JFK. More recently, he did the World Trade Center film with Nicolas Cage. And he is an avowed conspiracy theorist. He is convinced he knows exactly what happened to Kennedy and some other conspiracies. But the genius of this cameo is that we know as the audience, Dave Kovic is not Bill Mitchell. Bill Mitchell is in a fucking hospital somewhere. Everybody thinks that this guy, Dave, they know him as Bill Mitchell. No, the guy had a mild cerebral event, and here he is back in power. There's no conspiracy. Oliver Stone is on there, and he's barking at Larry King. If you look at images from before when he had his medical emergency and after, I'm telling you, Larry, it's not the same guy. And because this movie, in this one regard, is a product of its time, I saw the film with a packed theater in Woodbury at what is now the Equinox Gym, just off the 135 Jericho Turnpike, Woodbury, New York, for those of you who know the area. It was a packed house. And when I tell you, everyone in the audience immediately recognized Oliver Stone and was fucking cracking up when he's sitting there talking about it's a conspiracy, this is not Bill Mitchell. It was great. So Dave is a movie that has fun with itself. It tells a compelling story. You laugh frequently, and the performances are all really top of the line. Like Frank Langella absolutely kills it in that role. And he did play a lot of villains in the 90s, even the next year with the same filmmaker and Arnold in Junior. He's kind of a villainous character. And famously in the box office disaster, Cutthroat Island by Rennie Harlan in 95. Not a bad movie. I've seen it twice. It's not a bad movie. Lost almost $100 million for the studio. Through it all, we remember Kevin Kline. We remember the smile, the empty smile of President Bill Mitchell, the genuine smile of CPA and all-around good guy Dave Kovic. And that's the takeaway from the film. A great movie, but a phenomenal actor. Yes, an Oscar winner, so you can't say he's entirely underrated. But this is, to me, one of the most underrated individual performances that I have ever seen, especially from a guy who was known to be a huge talent. It's in my top 5 most underrated film performances. Kevin Kline as President Bill Mitchell, and CPA Dave Kovic, who pretends to be President Bill Mitchell, in Ivan Reitman's 1993 classic, Dave. And with that, we've reached the end of episode 97 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Friday, late afternoon, early evening, rainy, here with me. As I said, I kept today lighter, didn't talk about any unfortunate passings or anything like that. A great movie, an upbeat narrative, and all of that. But if you checked out this episode on the YouTube channel, you enjoy the content, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, turn on the notifications. Or if you've caught up with this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify, iTunes, Amazon Music, or iHeartRadio, click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 98 real soon.